Hello and welcome to yet another lecture number 23, which is specifically on research, medical research. So, we have been talking about several diseases in the context of epidemics and even otherwise. And of course, we have been talking about various kinds of studies and research even during those lectures. But this lecture is exclusively on research, the research culture, what prompted, sort of the problems and all factors associated with research. And as you would expect, the establishment of research institutions was a product of the intersection of some amount of colonial interest, colonial commercial and other considerations, and on the other hand, scientific interest, a genuine interest to understand the dimensions of various disease and ways of cure and all that. And there were, of course, these kinds of specific reasons. So, one was the concern about having a healthy workforce, which would ensure the profitability of the colonial enterprise. Another would be to bolster or at least maintain the reputation of the colonial enterprise abroad, so especially at a time when there were a lot of bad press, bad public opinion about certain of the things happening in India, so whether it's the exploitation or the atrocities of famine and all those kinds of negative reports which are going from here. So, all of those can be neutralized by some good research being done. So, that was another propelling factors. And more directly, it could reduce the risk of epidemics, which has epidemics which have impact on a lot of economic activities in diverse ways. So, in that way also research could help and contribute to economic benefits. So, coming to some of the problems in the methods of understanding disease and tackling them. So, we have been saying that by about the 1880s, the rest of the world had come to terms with the germ theory of disease, so which was a totally new understanding of disease as opposed to earlier forms like humoral theory or other kinds of environmental theories like miasmatic theories and other such things. But as we already saw, the colonial medical establishment here in India was very reluctant, not very reluctant, so they were also very forcefully denying any kind of causal relationship between enteric fever, which is typhoid, and or other such diseases like malaria. So, they denied any connection between those diseases and germ theory. So, even as I said from 1880s, after the discovery of suspected causal organisms, in fact, the sanitary commissioner of the government of India was very categorical that germ theory just cannot be applied to the entire history of, for instance, enteric fever in India or to any other disease. And on the other hand, so they were also concerned that putting too much undue emphasis on a specific organism could also prejudice the larger sanitary measures, all-purpose sanitary measures which they were doing. So, which they felt was more effective, more comprehensive, as it was taking into account whether in sanitary condition, the contamination of water and food, all that. So, which meant, so this kind of reluctance in this kind of denial mode carried the danger of all medical policies being focused too much or sometimes even exclusively on sanitary measures. And apart from so, all this is with regard to understanding the particular cause and differences they're taking or not taking. But since we are talking about research, so there were some problems with research approach to research as such in general, because I'm mentioning this particularly because the kinds of things we are talking about here, about the role of germs and all that, was in fact spawning not only new interest in research, but an entire new fields like bacteriology and parasitology. So which meant there should be that kind of mode and mood, that kind of a culture which is very conducive and which will react very favorably to these kinds of emerging trends. But what we see in India was actually the opposite. There was from the beginning in the colonial enterprise, there was a general discouragement of research. So officers, medical officers were seen more from a bureaucratic point of view. So they had their primary task was to discharge their administrative duties and their actual ward work, so actual work as doctors, as healthcare workers. So they shouldn't be acting too smart and talking about things like research. And therefore, since that was the trend, so that was the untold message that you shouldn't be acting too smart, thinking of these kinds of things. So just do your job, because Indian medical service is like, it's like a kind of a service. IMS is Indian Medical Service, so it's not like some kind of a research enterprise or research body. So they were constantly reminded of it in very many indirect ways, and therefore the IMS officers or general health professionals also try to tread the safe path and not being too unconventional to be thinking or talking in terms of research. And of course, there are always exceptions like Ronald Ross, struggled hard and made their way. And of course, generally also the medical establishment took research on a more serious note, especially with the recommendation of the Plague Commission in 1901, and also there was a need to find alternative methods to coercive actions. So as we saw, say for instance, the plague or other epidemics, cholera, so lots of steps which had to be taken, which involved a lot of cultural clashes, too much of invasiveness, and therefore, so research was one option to which could give alternative paths to those kinds of coercive measures. And of course, there was also pressure from the medical establishment in Britain, especially given the fact that India was a very fertile ground to study so many diseases. So as much as diseases were a problem, there were also an opportunity, at least from a science and research point of view. And generally, there was by this time a general push for laboratory research, with more and more discoveries of germs and parasites and the vectors, and especially successful identification of some of these agents in the case of malaria and plague. So that built a new tempo and momentum. And there was also the realization that localized bacteriological research, so focusing on the particular diseases of particular areas, could in turn contribute to greater awareness of all the kinds of epidemic diseases themselves, and also reliable knowledge about the history of the growth and intensity of the particular disease. So for instance, so if you know about the cholera virus, so it will also be helpful even from a sanitary point of view. So it could beyond the particular diseases, it could also be useful for more common everyday sickness, and address the questions of mortality generally born out of other reasons also. And therefore, research, and particularly the emerging new field of bacteriology, assume the same stature, the same level of importance in public health that, for instance, vaccination had about a century before. And as I said, a place like India with its diversity of diseases and its mosquitoes and other kinds of germs and carriers was one wide open laboratory for these kinds of studies. And so the benefits of the studies here could contribute to not only to understanding of disease here, but also the wider global body of knowledge, and consequently to healthcare beyond India as well. So these were some of the kinds of reasons related to diseases and the kinds of emerging research atmosphere. But also there was the role of personalities that also matters, who's at the top. So for instance, Lord Curzon, the Viceroy, was a great proponent of imperial research. So he was a great fan of setting up many central research institutions, which in fact happened during his viceroyalty, because he was one who firmly believed in very fruitful relationships between the government, the scientific establishment, research, and the making of public policy. So broadly, between science and policy. And so apart from his own personal belief and interest in this kind of relationship, so he also lent the authority of his office, so which in fact had very practical fruits, especially in particular fields like agriculture and medicine during the term of his viceroyalty. And of course, there are also other kinds of personalities who matter. So in this case, more specifically scientific ones. And so this one is a very important one. This is Hankin. So a great boost to research climate in India happened when, especially in the context of the rise of bacteriology as a new field. So that came when H. Hankin was appointed as a chemical examiner for the northwestern provinces in 1892. So when you talk about examiner, so you shouldn't confuse it with some kind of an examiner as in an academic institution like a PhD examiner or internal or an external examiner who is coming to value papers or thesis. So here examiner means so examining say water bodies, testing those kinds of examining things related to healthcare, examining soil for instance, toxicity of a material, so that kind of so that's a specific post. So he was appointed. So his appointment to that post was a very welcome thing for so not only for what he was doing that job, but to the larger question of research, because he was someone who was very well versed with these latest developments and with the works of some of the emerging big names in the field like Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch. He was also a gifted writer, and through his work, his own research work, medical work and writing, she could create the kind of awareness and appetite for research, which as I said was very much lacking with the kind of the colonial bureaucratic medical structure and culture. So he campaigned very vigorously, for instance, for particular things like the establishment of the anti-rabies pasture institute in India. So several of them which are established. The first one was established in Kasauli, up in the hills in 1901. And of course, so keeping the point about the role of particular individuals. So another big name which mattered was Haffkine. So he arrived in India in 1893, and he again was a leading and emerging bacteriologist, and he was trained in Paris itself, though he was Russian born, so he was trained in Paris. He arrived in India in 1893, as I said, and he arrived actually on the recommendation of the British government because he had approached the British government for permission to visit India to conduct trials for the cholera vaccine. So he had some understanding of the efficacy of the cholera vaccine in other contexts. So he wanted to do his trials in India, and so he was allowed. The British government impressed upon the colonial government in India to allow him, and he came and he conducted his trials, and in fact the efficacy of that cholera vaccine was proved in the Indian situation as well. So when plague broke out in 1896-97, the government now the government requested him for help and suggested to him that he could possibly develop a vaccine, so which in fact he did too. So it's one of the first vaccines developed within India. So especially now in the context of COVID, we have been talking a lot about vaccine and India's special place as a global supplier. So here we see, so it was even discovered here and in his lab at Bombay, so which was called the Plague Laboratory since 1899. So later it was renamed as the Bombay Bacteriological Laboratory in 1905 and eventually as the Hafkin Institute in 1925. So it's important to note that neither Hankin nor Hafkin were members of the IMS or the Royal Army Medical Corps, which was particularly in charge of the white component of the Indian Army here. So which meant that so there were other faces who were playing an important role. Of course, it doesn't mean that IMS officers were not involved. So, for instance, Ronald Ross, Leonard Rogers were all IMS officers, but there was now room for people from beyond the IMS. One of the important milestones in this new culture of research and especially in the emerging field was the setting of the Imperial Bacteriological Laboratory, which was opened in Pune, and of course it will be moved up the hills later on for reasons of climate and temperature and other things. So here the particular focus was on veterinary science, so that's also something to be noted. So it's not just about human beings, of course. There's a connection between the animals treated under this rubric and humans, like supply of milk and other such things. But veterinary science generally was one of those fields under the broad rubric of tropical medicine, which attracted attention. And more such specialist institutions were created for research into diseases like plague, cholera, and other tropical diseases. So not only for research, but also for not only for the research on understanding of these diseases, but also for actual production of vaccines also to combat them. So one such was the Central Research Institute at Kazauli in the hills of Punjab in 1906, and it had a special responsibility for malaria research. Of course, eventually it also did other kinds of research as well. And there were also, so what we are talking about were imperial, so all India laboratories, and then there were there was the category of provincial laboratories. So two, in fact, were very famous. So one in Bombay. So we were talking about the bacteriological lab. So that was upgraded, and that's after that only it became the Hafkin Institute. So in that is 1925, in fact, as we saw in the earlier slide. So in Madras, the King Institute of Preventive Medicine was set up in the area of Guindy in 1904. So which again is still existent and doing pioneering work in that and other areas. In 1906, the bacteriological department, so now we have been talking about particular institutes. So bacteriological department as such, which was later called as the Medical Research Department. So this was created to oversee the running of these kinds of institutes and the as a kind of an overall body overseeing the researches being conducted at these institutes. Um, and so, as I mentioned earlier, so since so we have the example of Hankin and Hafkin already, and subsequently too, the recruitment was not was open beyond the fold of the IMS. One of the implications of all this is that so medical research became part of the state. It was part of the state sector, so rather than something which is done at the university level, so which is where researches generally happen. And also these laboratories had no access to patients unless they were medical colleges which had their clinics linked to the particular laboratories there. But so one saving grace is that the staff from here, so they went out and taught undergraduates in neighboring colleges. And always research involves funding, so that's one of the important determinants of the success of research in any given place. And one important landmark in that regard is the setting up of the Indian Research Fund Association, IRFA, which we will encounter repeatedly hereafter. So this was set up in 1911 through the efforts of the education member of the Viceroy's Council, Sir Harcourt Butler, and Sir Pardee Lucas, the Surgeon General at that time. So this can be seen as a kind of a foreshadow, the mother of what we now have as the ICMR, Indian Council for Medical Research. And one of the most significant things is that this was started even before the Medical Research Council was started in Britain. So, as you know, medical like the ICMR, and of course, even more famous and successful is the MRC in Britain. So, there are whole hosts of research institutions called the MRC labs, MRC supported labs. So, even today, so in fact, the several MRC labs in Britain, which are homes to several Nobel Prizes. So, even before the MRC was started, we had the IRFA here. So, the aim of IRFA was to recruit and train medical researchers and provide adequate fundings for that. So it channel funds from the government and private benefactors to approve programs of medical research. And of course, the funding came from an annual grant of 5 lakhs from the government, and the government always, so even when it funded, as you will see in several cases, it always encouraged alternative sources of finance. So that's something which, for instance, even governments now do. So for instance, institutions like IITs are still funded, but there's a constant advice to look for other sources of funding from the industry, from alumni and all that. So this has a long history, and given the colonial situation and the background, we know the hesitancy of the colonial state to fund. So there's always a prodding to find other means like public subscriptions, philanthropy and all that, and some bit of the money for this also came from such subscriptions. So whereby life members paid a lump sum of 5,000 rupees, whereas the temporary members paid 100 rupees annually. And of course, this was reasonable building up of a reasonable amount of funding. So, for instance, by 1927-28, IRFA was spending about 11 lakhs per year, so which was a considerably high sum for that period. So, that kind of money was spent on research. And of course, the focus was on imperial science, the kind of areas that we were talking about, and also specifically to set up imperial laboratories. So, apart from sponsoring those areas and those laboratories and those fields of research, it also financed the periodical called the Indian Journal of Medical research. So we also have to mention that journals play an important role as signifiers of the emerging scientific culture in a place. So this is one of the telltale signs of the level of science, especially in its modern form, in any given place, apart from other things like scientific bodies like Royal Society and all that. So this is one manifestation of how science, and in this case medical science, was coming to its own on Indian soil. So this journal was established in 1913, and it was edited by the Director General of the Indian Medical Service and the Sanitary Commission to the Government of India. And this was accessible to members who were also outside the non-medical community. So IRFA, as I said, promoted field research across several new and emerging disciplines, areas, and of special focus and importance was tropical medicine, so which itself was an emerging domain, as we saw, and which in turn encompassed several domains. And particularly because it was touted as a new area, so there was also an insistence on new kinds of institutions, both for training, for education, as well as research. And also tropical medicine was acquiring great currency as a central paradigm for the epidemiological challenges of the 1890s, and also in reviving IMS prestige. So in fact, considering the importance of this emerging field of tropical medicine, there was criticism in British medical circles about the lack of commensurate interest in the area, especially for the promotion of research. So not only in the colonies, but in Britain itself, by way of general interest in a new field, and also by way of so those kinds of institutions in Britain itself, possibly providing ground for preparing doctors there itself, with all the advantage of the metropolis. So before going to the colonies. So in course of time, so this was redressed. The Liverpool School of Tropical Medicine was founded in 1898. This was the first institution in the world for research and teaching in tropical medicine. And soon the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine was started in 1899. And the prospect of research into tropical disease was also used as attraction for getting talented young British into the IMS. As we saw, like IMS was losing much of its sheen, especially it was not a very attractive proposition for the young emerging English medical graduates. So due to several reasons, one of which we saw was because too many Indians were also getting into it. It was getting too Indianized, and there were other such reasons, better opportunities back home, other such things. But now IMS could be an attractive destination, particularly because of the new kinds of opportunities opened by this emerging field. And within India itself, the just like the Liverpool and London schools, the Calcutta School of Tropical Medicine was opened in 1921, again to study a wide range of tropical diseases. And much of the funding and research strategy of IRFA was also channelized towards tropical research. The predominance of tropical medicine manifested in works in several related fields like veterinary science, as I mentioned earlier, tropical surgery, tropical midwifery, and of course with prolific publications on these areas coming out from India in the 1920s and 30s. So, and the Indian medical establishment also collaborated with the League of Nations, so which was formed at the end of the First World War to promote greater international understanding. So the Indian medical establishment collaborated with that international body in its own medical and sanitary works. Also, the Indian establishment was very active in the Far Eastern Association for Tropical Medicine. In fact, the annual session of that association was held in Calcutta in 1927. Also, now, as I said, one of the important changes that was happening to IMS was that more and more Indians were entering the IMS. So, just as they were entering the IMS itself, so more and more Indians were also participating in the emerging research fields and opportunities, and they did excel in several areas. And Upendranath Brahmachari's work on Kala-Azar is well known. So, what he did in the 1920s. So, another big name is R.N. Chopra, who was a professor of physiology at the Calcutta School, and he was known for his interest in pharmacology, but already he was very famous in that domain. But he also had interest in tropical medicine, not just interest, in fact, he even published a textbook on tropical medicine in 1936. Then this journal we are talking about, so IJMR published the pioneering works which are coming out from India on malaria, cholera, Kala-Azar, plague, and several fields. So, which established its own stature as a leading medical journal, and all of these things. So, whatever we have been discussing so far, so the various kinds of researchers, the kind of towering personalities who were here in India. So, some of them who had come straight from Paris, and so all these kinds of advantages, the very conducive situations together raised India's place in medical research. So, even as it was a colony, so what it meant in terms of actual alleviation of the sufferings of healthcare, that's a different question, but at least in terms of research, so it's something very significant that even before independence, so India's name, including participation of Indians, so India made a name in the international stage in the world of medical research. So, on that note, we will close this lecture. Thank you.